long chapter, 47 verses. Leviticus chapter 11, starting with verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the animals which you may eat, among all the animals that are on the earth. Among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those that chew the cud, or those that have cloven hooves. The camel, because it chews the cud but does not have a cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The rock hyrax, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The hare, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. And the swine, though it divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, yet does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you." Verse 9. "These you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever is in the water has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, that you may eat. But all in the seas or in the rivers that do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water, or any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. They shall be an abomination to you. You shall not eat their flesh, but you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. Whatever in the water does not have fins or scales, that shall be an abomination to you." Verse 13, "And these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the kite, and the falcon after its kind, every raven after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, and the hawk after its kind, the little owl, the fisher owl, and the screech owl, the white owl, the jackdaw, and the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe, and the bat. All flying insects that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you. Yet these you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all fours, those which have jointed legs above their feet, with which to leap on the earth. These you may eat, the locust after its kind, the destroying locust after its kind, the cricket after its kind, and the grasshopper after its kind. But all the other flying insect which have 4 feet, shall be an abomination to you." Verse 24, "By these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until evening. Whoever carries part of the carcass of any of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. The carcass of any animal which divides the hoof but is not cloven-hoofed, or does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Everyone who touches it shall be unclean. And whatever goes on its paws among all kinds of animals that go on all fours, those are unclean to you. Whoever touches any such carcass shall be unclean until evening. Whoever carries any such carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. It is unclean to you." Verse 29. "These also shall be unclean to you. Among the creeping things that creep on the earth, the mole, the mouse, and the large lizard after its kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand reptile, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. These are unclean to you among all that creep. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until evening. Anything on which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean, whether it's any item of wood or clothing or skin or sack. Whatever item it is in which any work is done, it shall be put in water, and it shall be unclean until evening. Then it shall be clean." Verse 33, "Any earthen vessel into which any of them falls you shall break, and whatever is in it shall be unclean. In such a vessel, any edible food upon which water falls may become unclean, and any drink that may be drunk from it becomes unclean. And everything on which any part of a such carcass falls shall be unclean. Whether it is an oven or cooking stove, it shall be broken down, for they are unclean, and they shall be unclean to you. Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern in which there's plenty of water shall be clean, but whatever touches any such carcass becomes unclean. If any part of any such carcass falls on any planting seed which is to be sown, it remains clean. But if water is put on the seed, and if a part of any such carcass falls on it, it becomes unclean to you." Verse 39, "If any animal which you may eat dies, he who touches its carcass shall be unclean until evening. He who eats of its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. He also who carries its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening." Verse 41, "And every creeping thing that creeps on the earth shall be an abomination. It shall not be eaten. whatever crawls on its belly, whatever goes on all fours, whatever has many feet among all creeping thing that creeps on the earth, these you shall not eat, for they are an abomination. You shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creeps, nor shall you make yourselves unclean with them, lest you be defiled by them. For I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate yourself, and you shall be holy. For I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth. For I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the law of the animals and of the birds and of every living creature that moves in the water, of every creature that creeps on the earth, to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between the animal that may be eaten and the animal that may not be eaten. The Lord had a blessing the reading of his word. You may be seated. A lot of dietary laws are brought forth to us in this chapter. And in this passage we are told what is to eat and what not to eat. And there are those that sit back and want to debate why. Why is it that certain things are acceptable and certain things unacceptable? And it's been stated for decades that the belief by many is that it is because we now know today that certain foods are bad for you. We now know, for example, that if you eat pork, that if it's not cooked correctly, you can get trichinosis or a tapeworm or something. We are told if you eat certain things, it is bad for you. But that cannot be completely accurate as the reason. For example, we live in Texas. If I were to take a hand, how many have ever eaten rabbit? There would probably be those, hands that have eaten rabbit. Rabbit is not dangerous to you, but it's listed here. Now, I doubt any of you have all eaten camel. But camel is not a dangerous food to eat. It is not harmful in any way, shape, or form, yet it's listed here. So it must not be strictly because some foods are bad for, all these foods are bad for you, therefore don't eat them. There must be something more besides just dietary reasons based on health. In fact, what we're going to focus on this morning is the purpose. Why have any of these? And here in this chapter, verses 44 and 45 really are one of the keys to the entire book of Leviticus. You know, when there was discussion back decades and decades ago of a thing called textual criticism. And textual criticism, there in its truest form, there is nothing wrong with textual criticism. In fact, you hopefully do some of that. And what is it? In its truest form, textual criticism looks at a passage of Scripture and starts asking certain questions. Who wrote it? When did they write it? Who did they write it to? Where were they when they wrote this? Where was the individual or the people that they were writing to? Where were they at this time? What's the theme of this passage? What is the purpose of this passage? How do I understand this passage? What did the writer mean in this passage? Those are all questions that have to do with good Bible study, good hermeneutical principles. But the problem came in textual criticism when they stepped beyond basic questions to not those, but to other things, and they brought their bias into it. And what do I mean? Back decades ago, there were those that taught Daniel could not possibly have written the book of Daniel. And when you were to understand why they believed that, the simple basis was Daniel could not have written the book of Daniel because it's too accurate in the prophecies. They all came true, therefore he could not have written it. It must have been written decades after he died and looked back and said, this is what he said and it came true. That's a bias. That is simply a belief that there is no prophecy from God. There were no true prophets of God. But textual criticism fell into this way of looking at things and trying to figure out why it could not have been written by this person, why he could not have meant what he meant. Bishop Spong of the Episcopal Church decades ago wrote on the Apostle Paul that he must have been a closeted homosexual. Because when he wrote against, whether it was in Romans or other passages where he wrote against homosexuality, really it's the modern day where people who are secretly gay try to push out that they are not by overemphasizing their disagreement with the gay community. Therefore, since Paul must have been overemphasizing it, he must have secretly been gay. That takes your bias into reading the Word of God, trying to find a problem with it rather than taking it for what it has to say is truth. To believe it must not have been inspired by God, but must have been merely a human writer writing a simple letter or a book to different people for their own personal reasons. Which gives us to the point of why trust anything in here then. But the purpose, as we look at the purpose of Scripture, as we look at the purpose of Leviticus, as we look at the purpose of our passage, verses 44 and 45 is one of the keys to the entire book. Look at that again with me. For I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate yourselves, and you shall be holy. For I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourself with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth. For I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. It all comes down to that we are called to be holy people. The children of Israel are out in the wilderness. They had left Egypt. They were there after the tabernacle had been built, after seeing all of the sacrifices. Fire, if we back up all the way to Egypt, from the plagues to the parting of the Red Sea, to the pillar of fire, to the pillar of cloud, to the fire coming down, accepting the sacrifice, the fire coming out, burning up Nadab and Abihu, to see all of this miraculous events, whether for good or ill, all of these miraculous events, and God is letting them know, I am the Lord. I am God. And he makes it specifically in verse 44, for I am the Lord your God. I am your God. And again, remember, all capitals, all uppercase in that word Lord, which means it's the name of God here, Yahweh. So I am Yahweh, your God, as compared to all the other gods that are quote-unquote lowercase g, all those others out there. I am the one true God, and I am your God. And we, throughout time, have tried to declare ourselves as human beings free from God. We have tried to declare ourselves free from the requirements of God. We have attempted to declare ourselves completely isolated from all that God demands or God requires. We have been taught since we were younger, particularly in a Western culture, that we are the captains of our fate, the masters of our own souls, that we will pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, that we will do all these things. We have even parlayed that into the church, where when it comes to salvation, you hear people say God does his part, you do your part. But when it comes to salvation itself, the whole part belongs to God. Because it is what Jesus Christ has done on the cross, not what I do or not do, that brings about salvation. That's why we say salvation is by grace, through faith, but by grace alone. But throughout time, human beings have tried to declare their own sovereignty. And understand, God, and hear me now, God will not tolerate any people or any government who usurps his authority. Any who set themselves as sovereign over themselves, God will only tolerate for so long. And ultimately, God will not tolerate them. God will bring judgment. Here, this warning is given to these people. When he says that I am the Lord your God, you shall therefore consecrate yourself. But through all of this warning, through all of these statements, yes, we should have a positive approach to life of what we are to do. And yet the world tries to say the Bible's filled with negatives. Yes, it has some of things not to do. In all of this warning, it says time and again, this is unclean to you. This is an abomination to you. Maybe not to the world, but to you as God's people. He's saying, to you as my people, these things are an abomination and unclean to you. As we said, eating a rabbit is not going to harm you. If you want to go eat a camel, I guess you can. It's not going to harm you. There are certain things listed here that will not harm you to eat. But yet God has declared them unclean. God has declared them an abomination to us. Now, what does this all mean? Number one, we are to be holy even in the smallest matters. We are to be holy even in the smallest matters. Now, the word holy is often taken to mean separate or set apart, but implies much more than simply being set apart. It is associated with wholeness or perfection. And understand, only God is intrinsically holy. When we say God is holy, we call his attention to the profound difference between him and all his creatures. So that's why when we look at this word holy, it's set apart. It's this otherness. It's something completely different. And the second thing we have to ask ourselves, or the second point, is a question which simply is, why does God do this? Why does God do this? Well, it tells us. Look at verse 44. For I am the Lord your God. Why does God do this? Because he's our God. Why does God set all of this up? Because he is our God. I am holy. You shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creepy thing that creeps on the earth. For I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt, not only because he's our God, but because of redemption, because of salvation, because of deliverance, because of freedom. God has done all of this because he has redeemed us, because he is redeeming us, because he saved us, and because he is saving us. He's saying, I'm the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt. He already brought them up out of the land of Egypt, and he's reminding them, why am I doing this? Because this is who I am. This is what I have done for you. And ultimately it tells us about his character. I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt. Last part of verse 45. To be your God, you shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. See, it really tells us, why does he do this? It's because of his character. Because God is holy. And again, understand that the secondary meaning of holy refers to God's pure and righteous actions. We understand whatever God does is right. God never does what is wrong. God always acts in a righteous manner because his nature is holy. So we can distinguish between the internal righteousness of God, his holy nature, and the external righteousness of God in his actions. In other words, God is holy in everything, who he is and what he does. And the key to Leviticus here is the holiness of God. Now there's some parts that we rejoice with and we say we have no problem with. For example, when he says back here in verse 41, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth shall be an abomination, it shall not be eaten. Whatever crawls on its belly, whatever goes on all fours, whatever has many feet among all creeping things that creep on the earth, that you shall not eat, for they are an abomination. You shall not, verse 43, you shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creeps, nor shall you make yourselves unclean with them, lest you become defiled by them. For I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Hey, we got no problem with that, right? I got that part down. Lord, I agree. I will not eat any bugs. I will not eat all the creeping things that has many legs that are creeping out there. I am not going to do that, Lord. I'm with you. No problem. But some of this, we sit back and wonder. And see, this takes us to our third step. Holiness is the Lord's desire and design. It's not just because seeing a centipede barbecued is not, does not increase your appetite. It's not just for that reason. It's because it's about the holiness of God and the people of God to be separate. See, they were to give testimony that God is holy. And so our question is, how was Israel to bear the testimony of holiness? How were they to declare that they were the people of God? By living holy lives, by being separate, by being unique, by being different. See, the Christian today is not to be walking with the world. We are to be separate. We are to be unique. We are to be different. Paul said, Jesus in one of his prayers simply said, Lord, I pray for them. But he never prayed that, and he makes it clear, not to take us out of the world. Why? Because we are in the world, but we are to be a separate people. We're not to become all monks. We're not going to have a compound somewhere and all live together from the rest of the world. We are to be different than the world, unique from the world, set apart from the world. But what does the world do? Philosophy. Not theology, but philosophy. And the history of philosophy, whether you love Aristotelian, Aristotle, whether you love Plato, if you get into philosophy, there are some great philosophers in the world that just want to make you laugh. My favorite philosopher was always Zeno. Zeno, his philosophy was that nothing moved. It only has the appearance of moving. So you really don't move. The things you see don't move. So the old concept, you remember that old rhyme when we were kids? I shot an arrow into the air, and where it lands, I know not where. Well, that's because it didn't go anywhere. It didn't move. Zeno was the one that took the original concept of the tortoise and the hare and explained why you can give the tortoise a head start, and every single time the tortoise will win. Because in his concept and in mathematics, they still argue over Zeno's paradoxes and Zeno's problems because they are impossible to resolve, because he makes it in such a way, and his argument is such a way that you can never win. But in the history of philosophy, what we see is very clearly one step leads to another. And I would tell you, we in this country and to a point in this world are at the last step. See, what begins in all of philosophy, and even in the realm of the church, is skepticism, where we start to wonder, as Pilate had asked Jesus, what is truth? And of course he walks away after asking the question. Skepticism tries to say there is no absolute truth. And if there is an absolute truth, it's unknowable. So skepticism is really one of the first steps, which then leads to moral relativism. What's truth for me may not be truth for you. What's right for me may not be right for you. And all of a sudden we have politicians and people of prominence saying, well, I may personally be against abortion, but I have no right to say anything about you. It all becomes moral relativism. And then the third step comes. All through history we see this. Skepticism leads to moral relativism. Moral relativism eventually leads to barbarianism. And dare I ask what we see in our streets? What we're seeing in the streets of some of our major cities, isn't it borderlining barbarianism? When a man walks up in North Carolina to a 5-year-old boy playing in his front yard, walks up, takes a gun, and just shoots him in the head for no reason. When you see children getting shot for no reason. When you see seniors, 70 and 80-year-old women who are standing in front of a federal courthouse trying to tell the protesters stop, and they throw paint and all kinds of things on top of them. When people are going to these quote-unquote protests just to shoot and loot and riot and rob, not caring about what it does to anyone else. Are we not quickly approaching barbarianism? But it all begins with skepticism. What is truth? To moral relativism. You can't know it, or there is no truth. So therefore it's whatever I think is true for me. To ultimately barbarianism. And there was barbarianism at the time here. Barbarianism is nothing new. We think in our history of just over the last 2,000 years, and we think of the barbarians. And Paul mentions Greek or barbarian. In other words, civilized and uncivilized. And again, if we take that tact of barbarianism as uncivilized people, we have a number of people in our country acting uncivilized. But what does God say? For I am the Lord your God, you shall therefore consecrate yourselves, and you shall be holy. In other words, you be different. You don't walk the way the world walks. You don't act the way the world acts. You don't talk the way the world talks. You be different. In fact, in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17, Apostle Paul said, "This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk, in the futility of their minds." Don't act like them. And see, all of these sacrifices we've been reading about, all of these rituals, all of the diet, and even the clothing and the cooking are all carefully ordered by God to teach them that they are to live differently from everyone else. Let's be honest, it's a temptation to go along with the crowd. It's a temptation to go along and imitate the pagan practices of all the other heathen nations. And ultimately, they would do that. And Israel's defilement would ultimately lead to their discipline. And I fear that the church today is following the same philosophy and becoming more and more like the world. G. Campbell Morgan, who was considered the Prince of Expositors, I believe he was right when he said the church did the most for the world when the church was least like the world. Believers must not only walk worthy of their calling, must not only walk in love, but they also must, according to Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 and 17, see then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. And then in verse 17, therefore do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. We're to walk differently. We're to walk carefully. We're to walk with purpose, not as fools. See, the Jews knew what God said was clean and unclean, and who exercised constant caution. They were unlikely to touch something unclean and defile themselves. But it was inevitable that the people would become unclean. People would defile themselves. That's an inevitability because we see all of these things that if something dies, don't even touch it. Well, what are you supposed to do? Leave all these dead things laying around? There were those that were appointed to do such things, particularly people. But because they knew, and God knew it was inevitable that people would become unclean, God gave them the means to become clean again. Uncleanness was not a permanent position. As we read, most of that was over by nightfall. So if you became unclean first thing in the morning, the worst thing is, in the middle of summer, it might last 12, 14 hours, and then you're clean again. If you're a very particular person, you would hope you became unclean 10 minutes before nightfall. So your uncleanness would only last a very short time. But in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 8, Paul tells us, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light." See, he tells the Israelites, consecrate yourselves to be holy. We're told in the New Testament, consecrate yourself to be holy. Purpose it in your heart, in your mind. Don't just let it happen. And Paul tells us very clearly, we were in darkness, but now we're in light. So therefore walk that way. Live that way. And if we walk in the light, we won't stumble over some carcass in the darkness. Because God's word is the light that directs us. In Psalm 119, verse 105, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Through all of this, what is God saying in this key for us? Look at it again. For I am the Lord your God, and you shall therefore consecrate yourself, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourself with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth, for I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. So what is he saying through all of this? Simply put, imitate the holiness of God. Imitate the holiness of God. Don't let it be an accident when you do something right. But rather, consecrate yourself. Commit yourself. Purpose in your heart and mind that you will walk in the light. We're going to sing one more time this morning. Miss Linda, if you will, please.